It's 2016 and imagine you live in Ireland and one day a letter shows up at your door. You've been randomly selected, like jury duty, except it's not a trial. It's your country's constitution. Specifically, the one question Irish politicians have refused to touch for 35 years. The one that's too divisive, too dangerous, and too career-ending to go near it. And you? Well, probably you are a teacher, a nurse, a retired electrician, whatever you want. But you and 98 other random people are being asked to solve it. You meet for 5 weekends. You hear from experts. You argue on the issue. Listen to the others. And finally, you vote. 64% of you say that the law must be changed. The opinion formers call it radical. Polls say the public isn't there because they indicate that only 23% of Irish voters agree with your position. So it was all a disaster. At least that's the narrative. But 1 year later, Ireland holds a national referendum. The entire country votes. And 66.4% say, okay, yeah, let's change the law. So you actually didn't overshoot. You got it spot on. 99 random people with no campaigns or donors or party loyalty arrived at almost exactly the same answer as 2.1 million voters. But how? Here's what made it work. These 99 people had something that voters almost never get. First of all, time. They met over weeks, not minutes. They didn't walk into a booth, check a box, and leave. They sat with a question. And also information. They heard from doctors, lawyers, constitutional experts, women who'd been directly affected by the law. Not campaign ads or Twitter threads. Actual evidence presented by people who knew what they were talking about. And maybe the most important thing, they had nothing to lose. They weren't going to be re-elected or keep the donors with big money happy. And also there was no party influencing their vote. They were just people thinking it through. So that's what made the result so uncomfortable for the political class, because it meant the problem was never that Irish citizens couldn't handle the question. It was that the system they elected to represent them couldn't. And Ireland didn't do this once, they did it 4 times. The assembly before this one led to the marriage equality referendum. The process was the same. But here is the thing. Ireland isn't unique. This has happened in France and Belgium, Germany, and Canada. The OECD, not exactly a radical organization, has counted over 700 of these processes across 34 countries. And this whole thing has a word, and most people never heard of it. It's sortition. Selection by lottery. The idea that you don't vote for your representatives, you pick them at random. It sounds weird and insane. It sounds like the kind of thing someone would pitch at 2 a.m. after too many drinks. And someone probably did that. But it's not new. And it's not untested. And when you find out where it comes from, it changes how you think about the word democracy. So in the 1930s, archaeologists were digging through the ruins of the Athenian Agora, the old civic center of ancient Athens, and they found a strange object. A tall stone slab, about the height of a person, with rows and narrow slots carved into the face and a tube attached to one side. And nobody had any idea what it was. Turns out it was the most important piece of democratic technology ever built. More important than the ballot box and the voting booth. Here is how this thing worked. If you were a citizen of Athens, you had a small bronze token with your name on it. On selection day, you'd walk up to this slab and slide your token into one of those slots. Once all those slots were filled, an official would pour a mix of black and white marbles into the tube. White marbles meant your row is selected, and you serve. The black means you go home. That's it. That's sortition at its finest, with absolutely no campaign, fundraising, speeches, or promises you don't intend to keep. And it wasn't some small-scale experiment. In Athens, 90% of public offices were filled this way. The courts, the Council of 500 that set the legislative agenda, most magistracies, all selected by lottery. The only positions they actually voted on were military generals and a handful of financial officers, about 10% of the total. Terms lasted 1 year, and most offices couldn't be held twice. And if you got selected, you still had to pass a public examination to verify you weren't a criminal, you hadn't dodged your taxes, and you met the basic requirements. So it wasn't just pure chaos. There were checks even back then. This system ran for roughly 200 years. Multiple generations of Athenians governed themselves this way. Aristotle, the guy whose political philosophy is still taught in every university on the planet, had a very clear opinion about all of this. He wrote in Politics, "It is thought to be democratic for the offices to be assigned by lot. For them to be elected is oligarchic." Just give it a second and think about this. I know it took me way more than that. So elections are oligarchic and lotteries are democratic. That's what Aristotle said, roughly. 2000 years later, a French Enlightenment philosopher wrote almost exactly the same thing. The suffrage by lot is natural to democracy, as that by choice is to aristocracy. So this wasn't a controversial take or something. For most of recorded political thought, this was the obvious agreed upon position. Lotteries are democratic, elections are not. Now, before you start picturing some golden age, Athens had some serious problems. Only 3 adult men could be citizens. Women, enslaved people, foreign residents were all excluded. The mechanism was democratic, but the eligibility was not. So all this isn't about romanticizing Athens. It's about the concept, the marbles, and the principle that democracy means every citizen has an equal chance of governing, not an equal chance of picking an elite politician to govern them. But why do we use elections now? So if you are still here, please give this video a like if you feel like it and comment something down below, because it actually helps way more than you think. Thanks, and let's go back to the video. So the first thing to know is that Athens didn't stop using sortition because it stopped working. In 322 BCE, Athens was conquered, and one of the first things the new ruler did was dismantle the democratic institutions. But the idea didn't die. About 1600 years later, in Florence, a system called imbursazione emerged, or whatever you call it. Candidates for public office were nominated, filtered through elections, and then, and this is the important part, filtered again through a lottery. Names were drawn from leather bags. If you'd served recently or committed a crime, you couldn't be selected. So the randomness was layered with safeguards, specifically designed so that one single family or faction couldn't lock in control. Venice went even further. The process they used to select the head of state alternated between lottery rounds and election rounds in a sequence so deliberately complicated that historians still argue about how it worked. But the point of that complexity was simple: make it impossible for money or power to guarantee the outcome. And they used this system for over 1,000 years, from 697 to 1797. Absolutely fascinating. So here is the picture. Sortition wasn't an Athenian experiment that didn't work out. It was a tool that kept showing up in Athens, Florence, Venice, across 2000 years. Every time people built a system that was trying to avoid concentrated power, they reached for the lottery. And then in 1700s, something changed. To be specific, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, a new type of political system being designed from scratch. And the people doing the designing had heard about Aristotle and all of the other guys who talked about sortition. And they knew about Athens and Florence and Venice. They had 2000 years of evidence sitting in front of them, and they chose elections on purpose. This is the argument that political scientist Bernard Manin makes in The Principles of Representative Government. He says that representative government, the system we live in under today, was designed in opposition to democracy, not as a version of it, but against it. The founders didn't want random citizens governing. They wanted a natural aristocracy, a class of people selected by the public, but fundamentally better than the public, wealthier, more educated, and more connected. Elections were the tool for filtering those people to the top. Manin calls this the principle of distinction. Elections, by their structure, favor candidates who are different from average citizens. And if you look at any Western legislature today, the net worth, the backgrounds, and the professions, you'll see it working exactly like that. Your average politician is way better off than your average citizen. The word democracy used to mean selection by lottery. Aristotle and the team said so. The people who wrote Western constitutions knew about all of this. They chose an aristocratic mechanism, gave it a democratic name, and we've been living inside that contradiction ever since. So what actually happens when you go back to the original idea? Remember, this isn't hypothetical. The OECD has counted over 700 of these processes in 34 countries, more than 80,000 randomly selected citizens, and the pace is accelerating. Some of them worked, some of them didn't. In 2019, in France, 150 random citizens were selected. Macron asked them to figure out how to cut carbon emissions by 40%. This came out of the yellow vest crisis. The government had lost so much public trust that they turned to random citizens as a last resort. And those citizens delivered, with 149 proposals, detailed, serious policy. Macron promised to pass them without filter. Then he filtered. The citizens gave his follow-through a score of 3 out of 10. So the lesson is that sortition works as a deliberation tool, but if elected politicians still hold the veto, they will use it. The experiment worked, and scientists actually approved the proposals. I mean, they were good, not some bullshit people thought of over some good wine. But the lobby and politics killed it. So, can you actually make it permanent? There is one place that did. A tiny region in Belgium called Oost-België, with a population of 77,000 people. Their parliament voted unanimously to create a permanent citizens' council, 24 randomly selected residents with real agenda-setting power. The parliament is legally required to respond to the recommendations publicly. The smallest legislature in Europe quietly made the biggest democratic experiment in 200 years. Now, the obvious question is, what if you randomly select 150 people and they are all the same age, same background, same tax brackets? You don't just pull names from a hat. Modern assemblies use stratified sampling. France generated 300,000 random phone numbers and then filtered for age, gender, education, income, geography, and urban versus rural. The result is a group that actually looks like the country. Compare that to any parliament you know. But I'm not going to pretend that this is a silver bullet, the secret that the rich kept from all of us, building the biggest global conspiracy. It has real problems. You can't vote out a randomly selected citizen. If they make a decision you hate, you suck it up. There is no accountability mechanism. The quality of the result depends entirely on who designs the process, who picks the experts, who frames the question. That's the power. And not everyone who gets the invitation says yes. The people who show up might not be a perfect mirror of the people who don't. These are not fatal flaws, but they are not solved yet either. So, the next time there is an election, wherever you are, you'll stand in line, walk into a booth, and pick between 2 or 3 people you've probably never met. People who spent months fundraising and making promises and performing a version of themselves designed to win. And you will call that democracy. Everyone does. I'm not saying that's bad because this vote is the best thing society's agreed on so far. But just think about how funny it would be for someone to pick your name randomly. That's the whole reason I made this video. The concept is fascinating to me. Maybe sortition is not the best way of doing things, but it's the most weird, interesting, and maybe, just maybe, efficient. But we'll probably never find out. So in this note, I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. Thank you and see you in the next one.